you background on the two works that I've asked you to read this week, which really don't seem like they would go together, except in terms of being written during the same century in England. One is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, who was a very different author than Oscar Wilde, who writes the play we're reading, another comedy of manners, much like School for Scandal, The Importance of Being Earnest. Directly below this, where this video is posted on Moodle, you'll see the PDF for A Christmas Carol. I've also put a pretty good movie version of it, but of course I'm expecting you to do the reading as well. And regarding the connection between these two things, the connection is the examination of themselves that the Victorians did. The Victorians were really concerned with morality. They wanted to believe that they were succeeding at empire building, which at that time they indeed were. See the video above, which refers to the British Empire. They wanted to believe their success was due to a moral superiority to the peoples they conquered. But there was a problem with that. They really had just gotten more successful at colonizing, and they were not necessarily better at all as people. So the Victorians endeavor to see themselves as good. But in an era of industrial revolution, of which Dickens was on the impoverished end during his childhood, forced to work, I believe, in a factory when he was quite young, for little money, and who suffered because of the Industrial Revolution and its economics that were incredibly unjust to working people in England. He writes stories that are designed to engender pity and repentance from a cold, hard capitalism that hurts children like Tiny Tim, even indirectly. And Scrooge is the stand-in, of course. I'm not telling you a story, something you don't know about Ebenezer Scrooge. He's such an archetypal figure in our storytelling. He is the anti-Christmas man. He is neither generous nor is he kind. And when he is told that the poor are starving, he simply says, "Are there no prisons?" And he would not have been an uncommon capitalist of his day. There was an idea that is commonly referred to as social Darwinism by thinkers. Social Darwinism takes the idea of the survival of the fittest in a species that Charles Darwin talks about in his Origin of Species and applies it to human social constructs in a way that is really not good Darwinism from a biological standpoint, nor is it at all good for society, which is the idea that if you got rich, even if you screwed over a bunch of people and really exploited a bunch of other people, well, that's just because you're better. You are the part of the species that is fit to survive. What that is, most definitely, popular as that idea was, particularly among the rich, blaming the poor for slothfulness, which it was almost impossible to live long as a poor person in the Industrial Revolution in England as a slothful person, and a general moral dissipation. But that wasn't really the case. Working people had to work hard, and their families suffered a great deal, and children had to go to factory work instead of school, and industrial accidents weren't covered by some kind of insurance, and people had really slave wages. It's no accident that communism was invented in England at this time, And there was a potential risk for an actual communist revolution there because of the horrible way that people were treated when they were working. They they expected you, if you were, for all of their talk of ladies and their delicacy in the Victorian era, if you were a working class woman and you were pregnant, you couldn't take a maternity leave, and you were expected to climb on high ladders, to deal with noxious fumes, and the living conditions of the poor were horrible. The tuberculosis was rampant in part because of the close quarters. It would be impossible for me to overstate how bad it was if you were a factory worker in London in about 1850. You weren't breathing fresh air. You weren't drinking clean water. You didn't have a safe place to live. You didn't have a job that would ever give you a day off. You didn't have at all the conditions that would lead you to be prosperous. It was absolutely impossible to save anything. You were going to die young and you were going to die miserable. And that's what Dickens writes about in his entire opus. I'm not terribly fond of Dickens. He has a lot of tubercular virtuous virgins who are very weak and kind of are hand to forehead and don't have a lot to say for themselves. I don't like the way he talks about women because while they are lovely to him, it's like he's never met one. He's never met an intelligent, strong woman in his whole life. And that's annoying to me. And there are lots of poor boys who, by no fault of their own, are swept up in social forces well beyond them that force them to work in factories. And they struggle. And maybe they're orphans. And they're stuck in some kind of industrial era hell. It's awful. But A Christmas Carol is a reprieve from all of that misery, because what we see, in fact, is that even a man as hardened as Ebenezer Scrooge is, through supernatural intervention, which after all, Christmas as a holiday is about supernatural intervention of God on earth for lowly sinners, his character is redeemed. He becomes someone who will be generous and kind and loving, and someone who will be missed when he dies as an old man. So what Charles Dickens is doing is he's taking the story of Jesus and redemption, and he is applying it in a Darwinist context of society. He is making it the story of the British worker and the British capitalist system, with the people who exploit the working class as Herods, but not irredeemable ones. And when Ebenezer Scrooge talks about keeping Christmas in his heart throughout the year, what he's talking about is acknowledging the dignity and his obligation to pay a fair wage, where people help him in his business throughout the year. And so he takes a Christian message and applies it to society. And I think that that's terribly hopeful in an era which, I must admit, I wouldn't have necessarily have been hopeful. Well, I'm not in no way a communist, so am not a communist. I do understand why some people thought about communism in that era, because life was miserable and there seemed to be no possible escape for the poor in England, who were stuck in a system where they were really enslaved and died young, nasty, grisly deaths. But Dickens manages to give us a ray of light and hope. And indeed, I believe that story is convicting in a spiritual sense. I think it does make us reflect on our own actions. And that's Victorian morality, perhaps at its most efficacious, at its most persuasive. The importance of being earnest is, in fact, making fun of the moralizing of the Victorian era. The importance of being earnest, just think about the title. The word earnest means honest, true. If I tell you I am in earnest, What I'm saying is, I really mean what I'm saying. But this is not about that. This is not about the importance of being honest. This is a play where most people are lying about something to someone, and we see it. And the age of ideals that Gwendolyn expresses, saying that she has always hoped to marry a man named Ernest, is actually a dismissal of this age of ideals, because she's not hoping for someone who is earnest in the sense of is truthful. That would be possibly the last thing a person like Gwendolyn Fairfax would want. She doesn't want to tell the whole truth and nothing but it, and she doesn't want her husband to. And she wants somebody who will appear earnest, who will take on the trappings of the right kind of man named Ernest, because that will increase her appearance, her social cachet. And everyone has this kind of air of trivial nature, and it's very, very funny. Oh God, we're going to talk about this in class. We're going to find the funny and the importance of being earnest. The important thing you need to remember, so that you will understand why it is so dang funny, is because everything revolves around these rules that are so rigid of social behavior. Remember our Tea Party. And this is the moment when all those tea rules are being subtly or subversively broken. The rules about who marries whom are broken. The idea of birth is subverted because Mr. Worthing was found in a cloakroom in Victoria Station. And there is also the character to watch for the punchlines is Lady Bracknell. I aspire to be as funny as Oscar Wilde's Lady Bracknell every time I talk, because she says the funniest things. And we know we laugh. She does not. She is not a humorous person on purpose at all. But for instance, she's interviewing Mr. Worthing at one point in the play as a potential candidate for marriage for her daughter, Gwendolyn. And she says, "Mr. Worthing, do you smoke?" And he says, "I must admit I smoke," which would normally be no one was worried about cancer back then, but it was a vice. It's kind of messy. It would be less pleasant for a woman he would marry, was the thought. But she says, "I'm very glad to hear it. Every man should have a hobby." So the standard is about this strange set of very superficial appearances. And everything is a subtext for her kind of taking over the universe behind her husband, who is basically her hand puppet, and about gossip she refuses to fully acknowledge. And everybody else is lying and bunburying and just messing around. And so this moralizing is made fun of in a very deep way by Oscar Wilde, that allows us to laugh with the hypocrisy of an era where everyone was determined to see themselves as successful because their country was oh so good, when in fact their country was a colonial nation that exploited people all over the world. And while the people on the top benefited from it, by no means was that a universal benefit for all. We're going to read the counter argument to that next week. My subversive texts, The Importance of Being Earnest and A Christmas Carol. We're going to read Alfred Lord Tennyson next week, who is all in with the empire. Oh, he is team British Empire. And we'll talk about how he is and why he is, and what virtue he sees, because he sincerely does. Anyway, I hope you enjoy both of these works. Clearly, you will enjoy them if you do, for very different reasons.